Hello, and welcome to a special edition of Up Close on METV. I'm Charles Clapsaddle, Station Manager for Manatee Educational Television, and it's a great pleasure of ours to have with us today Representative Jim Boyd to talk about some of the issues that are facing our legislature. Representative Boyd, thank you for joining us again. It's always a great pleasure to have you into our studio and to talk about some of the critical issues that face this district. But in this case, you have a lot to talk about because it's some very serious issues that are facing the legislature at this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we talked a little bit ahead of time, but we, as you know, Charles, and thanks very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here with you and your team, and you do a great job of presenting good and important community issues to your viewers and our community. So thank you very much. Yeah, this year was a little bit unusual. We'll talk in more detail about it, but as you know, we ended a little bit abruptly. The Senate stayed a couple days after the House adjourned and came home, and the net result of all of it was we ended without passing a budget, which, as you know, is our only constitutional duty every year, that we have to pass a balanced budget. We left earlier in the week, Tuesday, because we just saw no path to get that budget passed by the end of the week, and logistically there really wasn't a way. Mm-hmm. So we knew we would have to come back in June or sometime subsequent date to have a special session. So at that point we thought we had accomplished everything that we could accomplish, and so we, in deference to the taxpayers and to cost to the state and the like, we decided to come home.
So, I mean, this is a little bit unusual, but not unprecedented. You know, the House has adjourned before. But in this case, you know, the differences between the Senate and the House were a lot to overcome. There wasn't any easy path to reconciling those differences, which I believe at the time was like a $4 billion difference between what the House has passed as its budget and what the Senate had recommended.
Yeah, that's correct. And you know, in respect to the adjourning a little early, and the House did this time, I've talked to a variety of legislators that were there before us, you know, at different times throughout the course of Florida's history, some that are obviously still around that I know, and they all told me, look, this has happened more than once. You're not the first to leave before the other chamber. Sometimes it's the Senate, sometimes it's the House, you know, and then there was the court case, and the Supreme Court ruled that us leaving 3 days early was unconstitutional. That was their ruling, and of course we live by, the High Court's ruling. I think there were folks on our side that would be willing to argue that, but it was really pointless, and all that would have done was taken more time and money to do. So we just accepted their opinion. But yes, there was what I consider a big policy difference that held the budget up this time, and that was the Medicaid expansion that the Senate wanted to advance, and of course, as you know, the House didn't. So I don't know when the last time a policy issue held up the budget. You know, normally it's haggling over this or that in the budget. Exactly. But typically that gets worked out in the conference before, you know, the budget is laid on the table for the 72 hours that it has to before we finally pass it in both chambers. So that was a little bit of an unusual twist, that we couldn't come to an agreement on the policy issue, so we were able to free up the ability to move the entire budget forward. So in essence, that stopped the entire budget process.
So now the Senate Majority Leader, Mr. Gardner, and the House Speaker, Mr. Christofouli, have agreed to come back for a special session. Now, what is going to be discussed and what's going to be part of that special session is still in negotiation and discussion. But obviously, the budget is the key element that's going to be discussed there. And as you mentioned, the healthcare difference is pretty vast. It's a huge policy, philosophical difference between what the Senate is putting forward and what the House is willing to accept at this time.
Yeah, as you mentioned, the Senate President and the Speaker are now working on the logistics of the special session. We've agreed that it's probably July 1st through the 20th, somewhere in that time frame. We haven't nailed June 1st, exactly. Thanks for that.
June 1st through the 20th.
Through the 20th.
So that's a very short time frame.
Yeah, and I believe we can only, special session can only go 20 days. So that's part of that. But logistically, we have to get through the budget process in time for the governor to review it and make whatever changes he might make to it, and then have it finally passed. So,
which, because the fiscal year for the state begins the 1
July
July
1st, that's correct.
And so whatever differences and whatever ratifications have to be made in that short time frame.
That's correct. So there's a couple ways the special session can go. We can address just the budget, or if there's issues that are attendant to the budget through a conforming bills or the like, we might be able to take those up. Or the President and the Speaker can agree on some specific policy issues that they might be willing to take up in that time frame as well. I don't know this for certain, but I would be willing to bet that if we do take up some policy issues, they'll be very confined and very, very tight in terms of their scope, because you can see if we started taking up anything and everything again, we just wouldn't have the time. Now, there is an abbreviated process that we can go through on those specific policy issues. Technically, when we sine died and the Senate adjourned their sine die at the end of the week, all bills that had not passed both chambers were dead. I mean, so there's no more chance, no further chance that they would go anywhere.
Moving forward.
So what has to happen is the Speaker and the President can agree on if there are those policy issues that we want to take up. And I'll use one as an example, the water policy, which was a big issue for Florida.
Major issue.
And it's very important. And I think the Senate agrees with the House that that is a very important issue for Florida. So if they want to take that back up, probably it would come through, I would guess, maybe one committee and then go right to the floor. So they can make those arrangements ahead of time. Another one was corrections. You know, we spoke about that.
Which is another major issue that, you know, both the House and the Senate took up this year.
They did, and you know, the unfortunate thing there was we had a good bill. It came back from the Senate with some changes we accepted. We made one little tweak, and in fact, the Senator Evers, who was the sponsor in the Senate side of the corrections bill, was on our floor when we were making that correction. Everything seemed to be okay with him and with moving it back to the Senate, and then it got back to the Senate and it didn't move, you know, when everything kind of came apart at the end. So that's another bill that might, and I don't know for sure, but might be one that would be able to be taken up. But I think if we see outside of budget any specific policy issue bills, they'll be very, very limited and very tight in terms of their scope.
And it would have to be because of the time constraints placed upon you within those between June 1st and June 20th to come up with a budget, an approved budget. Anything that takes up a great deal of time is taking away from those budget discussions.
That's correct.
So, but there's a lot of other things. You know, one of the things that is very important too is the student with disabilities issue that came up, and there was a bill that was came forward. That's another one that, you know, everything was moving forward, but it kind of stopped in its tracks. There's a lot of things that stopped in its tracks when the House and the Senate decided, you know, couldn't go much further. Yeah,
you know, back up into the bigger picture. It's not always bad that bills die. You know, I mean, we don't. My view has always been, you know, this was my 5th year. I don't go up there just to pass 6 bills because I have the ability or the capacity to pass 6 bills. If it's not good public policy, we shouldn't be doing it anyway. And lots of times, things kind of move along for one reason or another that may or may not ultimately be something we need. So the fact that bills may not make it is not necessarily a bad thing. That said, like the student disabilities bill, the corrections bill, the water bill, those are good public policy issues that we ought to embrace and really try to move through. So I hope, and again, I can't speak for the Speaker or the President of the Senate, but I hope when we get back together, we've got an agreement that some of those very important policy issues in a very organized manner we can take up and try to move through.
Now, part of your committee assignments this year, you're the Appropriations and, you know, the Ag and Natural Resources Subcommittee, along with the Regulatory Affairs and everything. You were right in the heat of things, in the thick of things, so to speak, as, you know, the session was underway. as the special session starts to formulate and think, how do you foresee it moving forward? Obviously, between now and June 1st, you're going to be on the phone, you're going to be meeting with people to see what are next steps. And in a general kind of overview type of thing, what do you see those next steps as being?
Sure, very good question. I don't, well, the different committees that we're all on, and I'm, as you said, on those committees, I don't expect those will all be meeting. I would be willing to believe that if there's a specific policy issue that might be best addressed through appropriations before it maybe comes back to the floor of the House and maybe the floor of the Senate for reconsideration, if you will. Those specific committees might meet briefly, and it probably be one of the bigger committees. There's nine, I believe it's 9 big committees, as we call them, and then the subcommittees are under them. So I would really, I wouldn't expect subcommittees to meet again. Although, there's 120 members out there in the Florida House and 40 in the Senate that all felt like their issues were good and important issues, but unfortunately they're just not all going to be able to be reheard in a, that finite period of time. So I would suspect you'll see, if the two leaders decide that we are going to get some policy issues on the table, there'll be a couple of the bigger committees probably that would hear them, and then and then basically pull them from that committee to the floor. So it might be one committee stop and then straight to the floor for action.
For a vote.
Correct.
So as you move forward, though, and we're talking about some of the major issues outside of the Medicare expansion, and so. There are some important issues. This year, the governor was very adamant about getting his tax cuts moved forward. Well, now that's kind of held in abeyance until a budget is worked out.
Right.
So, I mean, those are still on the table. Those may or may not be able to happen this year. Is that a fair assumption?
That's a fair assumption. I would, we've talked about before, and you know me, I'm an optimist by nature. I would hope that tax package, because it was a very well thought out and comprehensive tax package that I think,
very much so,
for the most part, the Senate agreed with us on as well. I don't know exactly the Senate's number, but our number was somewhere in the neighborhood of $670 million of tax cuts, which puts money back in Floridians' pockets. So I would hope that as part of our budget process, that would be able to be on the table. Now, the challenge will be, depending, and you alluded to it a moment ago, on the Medicaid and then the low-income pool funding.
Exactly.
The challenge will be if we believe, even though the formula has to change, we believe we're entitled to the low-income pool funding, which is about $2 billion.
Right.
The feds initially, 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, sent a letter to us saying that the low-income pool funding and the Medicaid expansion were inextricably tied together, so they wouldn't consider one without the other. 2 weeks later, we got a letter from the same department saying, no, they can be untied or looked at separately, which was good news and what we thought was the right response to begin with. So I hope, this is Jim, and if I could wish for something, what I'd wish for and hope for is the feds would release that $2 billion of low-income pool funding. I think that'll get us a long way toward taking care of the neediest of the needy among us.
Right.
We can have that Medicaid expansion discussion at some point in the future, perhaps, but at least
take care of an immediate problem.
At least it doesn't preclude us from taking care of an immediate need, an immediate problem right now.
Well, the low-income pool, that's administered through the federal government, is designated for those hospitals who have a preponderance of care for indigent patients, underinsured or no insurance thing. And without that money, those hospitals are in dire need. They wouldn't be able to provide that at any extent.
And listen, we knew, and everybody in ACA and the House and the Senate knew that formula needed to change. The feds had told us the old formula wasn't going to be able to last.
Right.
But we had proposed, I think, at least a couple of new formula proposals to the feds to be able to draw down that money. We feel, they may agree or disagree with us. I hope they agree. We feel that because of the rework on that issue, that we are entitled to that money and we should be able to get it. And I hope we will. I think that would go a long ways in helping us move the ball a little bit forward. Yeah.
Well, to further complicate the issue, Governor Scott has filed a suit against the federal government saying you can't demand that we adhere to Medicare expansion. You can't tie the two together. But at the same time, he's doing an outreach to sitting down and meeting with them to see if they can come to some kind of a solution as well.
Yeah, and Florida's not alone. I mean, other
That's
states,
true.
Texas, other states have essentially had the same conversations. They believe, like we, that the two shouldn't be tied, and we ought to be able to have those discussions. You know, there's some in Tallahassee that believe we ought to take the Medicaid expansion. The House has had another proposal on the table for several years in terms of
Right.
some help in that arena. But at the very least, we think there's precedent set, and we think the law is very clear that those two should not be tied, and they ought to be able to release one without the other. Then the question is, you know, will they accept the new formula that we've developed and pay the monies based on that formula? And it's a big number, and
It's a huge number.
you know,
When you're talking 2 something billion dollars
Right.
to be, it's a great resource for the state of Florida to be able to have access to. Now, you just said you're an optimist, forever an optimist, to do that. And as you move forward, I'm sure that your preparation and your research and your planning with your staff and your colleagues are moving forward. How do you begin to formulate, your work and your efforts to sit down with, the Senate to try to move forward? What is the major issue that, or implements that you want to see go forward?
Well, I think that we had a little bit of a cooling off period, if you will, or as one of my colleagues coined the phrase, we hit the reset button. Us being home for a month, I think will, allow everybody to kind of like, all right, let's settle down. Let's really think about what's important. And as I said this morning at a chamber, function that Charles, we spoke there and that you filmed, the Senate is well-intentioned, good people, just like the House. Both Republicans and
Exactly.
Democrats. We all want to do the right thing.
Okay.
We all want to do what's best for Florida. We all want to do what's best for our communities. I have no doubt that that's in everybody's heart and mind when they're up there. It's not this big fight that people would have you, believe it is.
That makes for good headlines.
It makes for good headlines, and I get the fact that the public just wants us to get our work done. We don't want to become a Washington because things are in gridlock there and not happening. So I get that and I fully understand it. But I really believe that being able to be home a little bit, talk to our constituents, and our senator and I have reached out to each other. We're going to talk, and others, my colleagues around the state have done the same thing with their senators. I trust when we get back, we'll be able to, kind of say, okay, look, we have a goal here. Let's move forward, and what's the best way to do it? And I'm not just being naive or cavalier. I really do believe we'll get there.
Well, I have to tell you, having the opportunity to visit in Tallahassee and see the operation, from at one level, it's the best and brightest that occupy those offices.
Well, that's very kind.
Staff included. The people that are interested in doing the people's work. And at all different levels. Now, whether or not there's philosophical or discussions or differences, that very well may be, but at the same time, I think everybody is interested in the common good.
Well, 100 years ago, there were philosophical and ideological differences. 100 years from now, there will be. There's some now. We disagree with that side disagrees with this side. The House and the Senate, we have our little tussle. But that's good, in my opinion, that's good government. That allows for dialogue, that allows for debate, that allows for discussion. And so good things happen as a result of that. It's just not one chamber pushing their agenda on the other one. And that's the reason our government's set up like it is in the bicameral system of the legislatures, which I really think best serves the public. But we still have to get our job done, and we all know that.
And I think, being the conscientious, dedicated, committed individuals that you are, I think that everyone wants to feel that they can want to do the best job possible. And how you do that and how you go about that might be a point of discussion, but you're all working towards that same goal.
Yeah, and I want to thank you. And I want to mention I want to go back to what you mentioned a minute ago, and that's the staff in Tallahassee, both on the House and the Senate side. I'm telling you, there's not been one staff member, and I've only, of course, worked with the House staff, that couldn't make a lot of money in the private sector. They're all bright, talented, hardworking, collaborative folks, and they're helping us as well, and they play an invaluable role in helping move good policy ahead for the state of Florida. So not only is it us that represent our communities, but we're backed by, I think, a brilliant staff, both in the House and the Senate, and that allows us to have good dialogue.
I think that's really well said. And I would not without any hesitation, say that the staff are working now, kind of
Well, they
around the clock, saying, finding the tools and the research that is necessary for you to make informed and educated decisions as you return.
They are, and they don't think twice about it, and they don't complain a second. During session, and especially the last 2-3 weeks of session, I can tell you, since I've been there, some of the lead staff people, they may go home at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning to take a shower and change clothes, and they're back at 6. I mean, that's how they operate. Now, granted, during the summer, hopefully they get a little R&R that they deserve when, well, this June they won't, but typically they would. So that gives them a little bit of an incentive to, or maybe not to be so tired from working so hard. I mean, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but they work very hard on Florida's behalf.
Well, having met some of your staff, I can only say, what a dedicated bunch of individuals that they are. So we're kind of winding down a little bit, Representative Boyd, and I want to give you an opportunity. Obviously, hearing from your constituents as you've been back here and you've been talking to people and you're always available to meet with any of your constituents at any time. What are you hearing from your constituents about their concerns about going back into a special session?
Mostly it's been positive. I haven't had really anybody yelling and screaming that, why can't you get your job done when you're there? They understand, and sometimes they understand there's differences that just preclude us from doing that. And sometimes, that's maybe not so bad either. There are issues out there that Florida cares about. I mean, less taxes is definitely important. Better education systems, and we did pass a pretty comprehensive education bill that the Senate did pass, so that will be going into effect, providing the governor. I believe he's already signed it. So, I mean, there are some good things that are coming, but they care about what's important to them. And mostly it's the economy, it's their families, it's employment, it's education. With our last year, the passing of Amendment 1, that's very important. Which is a critical thing.
And I want to point out, if I may, Representative, if I may, that where you took the, the initiative to develop, policy and procedures to set up a trust to how that money was being spent. It's not earmarking it for one thing or another. It's to set up a set of policies and procedures that will really mandate how that money is going to be used. And you're to be applauded for that, because a lot of people think, oh, well, this is special interest. Well, it's not really that at all. It's about being able to account for and be transparent with the money that Amendment 1 would be bringing in.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and that's very important because it's the conduit by which the money will flow to the various entities. And the Amendment 1 ballot language was acquisition, management, care, conservation. So there's a variety of functions that the Amendment 1 initiative asked us to handle with the 33% of the dock stamp money. So with the bill that we did, the monies will go into the Land Acquisition Trust Fund and be funneled through 2 trust funds at the Department of State and the Department of Ag. And then the Ag appropriations and the full appropriations will determine the budgets for each one of those areas where the money will go. But that was another bill that didn't make it across the finish line, and that's very important because as you know, 76% of the voters asked for the Amendment 1 to pass, and it did. So, or 76% voted in favor of it. So that we have to get right as well, and I believe we will.
And the key thing, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this too, is that because of the short session coming up, which your concentration, your efforts, and is going to be concentrated on the budget, there are a lot of things that will probably have to come back next year, and to go before the governor. Are you already developing or thinking about what those priorities might be and the efforts that you want to put into that?
Yeah, I think I am. I think my colleagues are. Certainly as a result of what happened with this session, people are already thinking about what's next for them, or what bills they didn't get done this year that would be good for next year. One thing I meant to mention earlier, which makes maybe it a little bit more palatable, is as you know, next year our session is January and February, not the traditional March and April. So what that does is just move the entire process up early. So we'll be starting committee meetings, I suppose, probably in September.
Christmas, probably.
Well, we'll be there probably in December, but we'll probably start as early as September with some committee meetings. So if we go September, October, November, maybe a little bit in December, hopefully not much, then January session starts. So
so the whole thing is kind of accelerated.
The whole thing is accelerated. So those that didn't get whatever they thought was important to pass passed. this doesn't make it any better right now, but it'll be a little bit sooner rather than later. We'll be able to take it back up again if it's important enough to
And that's
pursue.
a very short window. Time really goes quickly.
It does.
And by the time August rolls around, you're already getting ready for your September meetings. You've always been an individual representative who's really concerned about your constituents in this community. Manatee Glens, the school district, local government. You've always been very concerned with how you can give back to your constituents here. What would you like your constituents to know about your efforts on their behalf this year?
Well, thank you. You're very kind. Some of the things I like is, for instance, Manatee Glens. We in the budget, and again, we got to get the budget passed. We had $300,000 for 6 residency programs for psychiatric help at Manatee Glens. So that was one of the things that I was able to put into the budget. And there's a variety of things in our community: some water projects, beach renourishment, some initiatives for the college, the learning center at the college, equity funding for the college, State College of Florida, and then there's for South Florida and New College as well.
Exactly.
So, I listened to what those in the community ask for in terms of needs. Obviously, there's only so much money that can be spread around, but fortunately for our community, we've been able to get into a position where we've got a little more say at the table, which has been nice, and hopefully that will mean we're able to do things that are important for our community, not just for one group, but all of those things that I mentioned are really spread across our entire community, and to me that's very important and very gratifying that we're able to be part of that.
Well, one of the things too that you should be really proud of too is the expenditure in education per pupil funding. That certainly is nearing record levels this year, or proposed in the budget as well. So that's another significant factor that you've contributed to.
Well, thank you. It is very important. Education is critical to our state as growing and being and thriving, and being a place where families and people want to come and live and learn and work. And I think our per student funding is at record levels this year, providing we get it through the budget. So I'm trusting that will stand, and I believe it will, because those are just the right things to do. So it's great to be part of that as well.
Representative, we're kind of very short on time. I want to give you the opportunity. This was a tough year. You can go up there with the most optimism that this is going to be a banner year, that we're going to get some significant work done, and then situations and circumstances change, and obviously it's not as fulfilling as you would have hoped it would be. But I think anybody that knows you knows how hard you work and how dedicated you are to providing the best service possible. So in the remaining few minutes, I'd like to give you the floor to say, what are you looking forward to when you get back up there in June, which is basically right around the corner.
It is right around the corner. I look forward to a productive special session. I look forward to passing a good budget that helps Florida. We're all, again, I don't want to be redundant, but we're all really trying to do the right thing. I know some people are confused and curious and perhaps even upset. Why couldn't you do the work in the time that you're up there to do it in? There are a lot of moving parts and a lot of things that complicate the process. And believe me, I'm not making excuses. That's our job, and that's what we're elected to do. But I do believe both the House, the Senate, the Republicans, and the Democrats, my experience has been working together to try to do the right thing for not just their communities, but for Florida in general. So I believe we'll be able to get it done. Yeah, it's a little bit of a different end than we thought when we started, but in the end, if we can have the tax cuts that we propose, if we can fund education like we wanted to, if we can get the water policy and the corrections policy done, I think overall it will have been an exceptional session. We're putting some money away. We're paying down some debt. I mean, there's a lot of good that can come still out of this session. So I believe it will. It's going to be a lot of work in a short period of time, but that's what we're supposed to do, so that's what we will do.
Well, and in your position as the House Majority Whip too, you're in a position, not only, for oversight and leadership, but also in a position to help craft things as well. And I think your continued leadership is something that is very well placed for Manatee County. You've done a great service. So we'd like to perhaps invite you back at June 21st, perhaps maybe 22nd, you know, to kind of see where things have gone. You know, you have some major issues to face, and you know, I think with the leadership that you have and the leadership that this delegation has, can provide, you know, some of that effort that is needed to kind of help these issues move along.
I'd be happy to come back 21st, 22nd, whatever you ask. As far as my position, I am in a little bit of a unique spot, but I don't ever forget that Manatee County and Sarasota County are the ones that put me in that spot, and that's who I represent. So while I have a say at the table, which is nice, I think it's nice for our community because that's who I represent. So it's all good.
Representative Jim Boyd, you know, you've got your work cut out for you, but you know, if anybody can rise to the challenge to do it, most certainly you can, because you've demonstrated that time and time again. Thank you, Representative,
Charles.
And we'll
Thank
welcome
you.
you to come back at any time to give us some updates on any policy or anything that's happening in Tallahassee.
It'd be my pleasure. Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us on this special edition of Up Close on METV.